question
a lot
is,
of
the
new
question
Supreme Court
is,
justice,
the
radical
question-
left.
Will you
Who
shut
is your-
up, man?
listen.
We have ended this segment. We're going to move on to the second segment.
That was really a productive segment, wasn't it? Keep yapping, man.
Who would
White
you like me to
supremacists-
condemn?
White
Proud Boys.
supremacists and right
Proud
Proud Boys, stand back and stand by.
Look, here-
oh, really?
here-
oh, really?
Here's the thing.
I sent in the U.S. Marshals to get the killer of the young man in the middle of the street. They shot him, and for 3 days,
President Trump,
Portland wouldn't do anything.
Would you close down the oil
By the way, I
industry?
would transition from the oil industry, yes.
Oh,
I will
that's a big
transition.
statement.
The oil industry pollutes significantly.
I see.
And here's the deal. But
That's
you
a
can't
big
do
statement.
that. Well, if you let me finish the statement.
Trying to
I
respond.
never said I oppose fracking.
You said it on tape.
I did. Show the tape. Put it on your website.
I'll put it on.
Put it on the website. The fact of the matter is
Showed
he's
it last
flat lying.
Not since Abraham Lincoln has anybody done what I've done for the black community. Now, you have done nothing other than the crime bill, which put
Oh, God.
Oh, God is right. I'm telling you, why debate that guy? First of all, he doesn't debate anybody else. He doesn't debate Republicans. He doesn't debate Nikki Haley. He doesn't debate anybody. As the Wall Street Journal opinion page said a couple weeks ago, what's Trump going to do? Say, oh, Joe Biden, he's afraid to debate me when Donald Trump has been living in the fear of debating Nikki Haley now for months. Second thing is, the guy just lies. He makes stuff up all the time. So, you know, it doesn't make sense. Anyway, Alexi, in your piece, you're right in part this. I rewatched the 2020 Trump-Biden debate moderated by Chris Wallace, and it only confirmed to me that Biden shouldn't do it again. My neck was sore from shaking my head so much. Skipping a debate with Trump, which, to be clear, is not something the Biden campaign has proposed doing, would be consistent with the selective media strategy so far. It's also true that debates serve a useful purpose. Kathleen Hall Jamieson passionately made a case for them in her 2012 post-op-ed, arguing debates and other televised presentations are conducive to honestly explaining some more complex topics. Still, I'm not convinced another Trump-Biden debate would be worth it. When Trump's on the stage, anxious voters can't expect much honest explanation about anything. They also can't understand, they can't expect any rational discussion of the issues that are the most important to them.
Those clips you showed now, I mean, I'm like stressed internally from the crosstalk. I'm like, I hate conflict, I hate this. But you can barely even get a word in edgewise. I could barely understand what they're discussing. When Joe Biden would try to answer a question in good faith, Trump would give him maybe 3 to 5 seconds and then jump in with something totally derailing it. He's more erratic than ever before, Trump. The Hunter Biden issue, the trials, the investigations, every other word from Trump would be screaming about Hunter Biden, the corrupt Biden family. It would be a disaster for everyone and not helpful to any voters. Plus, people know their characters. I think a debate between Trump and Biden would mostly just show their personality and character at this point, and everybody knows exactly who these two men are, so we don't need 2 excruciating hours of them yelling over each other.
And Peter Baker, with Donald Trump, he has become more erratic. He has become more radical. He has become louder over the past several years and plays by absolutely no rules. And it seems to me, if you're going to have a debate that enlightens and informs, you have to have 2 people. Let's go back to 2012. You have to have Barack Obama and Mitt Romney, who will at least follow basic guidelines so people can learn about the issues and the candidates. We would not have that here with Donald Trump.
Part of the problem is that a debate is meant to test candidates and to show whether they have command of the issues and to force them to answer questions that are uncomfortable. So if we don't have a debate, fine. But are there going to be other opportunities for us to do that with these 2 people, these 2 men? And that's a real problem because neither one of them, frankly, is taking questions from hard questioners. Of course, Donald Trump did give an interview to Kristen Welker for Meet the Press, and Joe Biden has from time to time given interviews to Stephanie Ruhle and others from this network, for instance. But broadly speaking, neither one of them is doing the kind of interviews and taking questions in a hard way from reporters that previous generations have, and that's a real problem.
And that matters because I've gotten emails from readers who are like, I'd love to see a Trump-Biden debate because I want to see just how much or whether each man has mentally declined since 2020. And I think that's something else that people could potentially glean from a debate like that. But Biden is older, not necessarily as sharp as he was in 2020. I think it would be a little more difficult to keep up with someone like Trump this time around, who, as we have said, is more erratic, more unpredictable, and views something like this as not an exchange of ideas or defense of his own ideas, but sort of like a backyard brawl.
Willie, it'd be a couple of hours of insults. And again, if you're Donald Trump's team, if you're Donald Trump, what are you going to say if Joe Biden is like, no, I'm not gonna get down in the mud with the pigs here. I'm not gonna debate. What's he gonna say when Chris Christie was calling Donald Trump a coward? Debate after debate after debate for Donald Trump being afraid to debate Chris Christie. What's he going to say when Nikki Haley is saying, challenge him to one debate after another debate after another debate, and he's afraid to debate them too? He can't just decide after saying no to 16, 20, 30 debates that, oh, wait, now I want to debate this one time. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I mean, refusing again and again in this case to debate Nikki Haley, thinking he's punching down in some way. He thinks he's already wrapped up the nomination, but perhaps it's more likely that she's smart, experienced, nimble, young, vital, all the things that maybe he's not, and might run circles around him in a debate. And to Alexi's point, John, that was the clips we just watched were 3.5 years ago. Those two men were 3.5 years sharper, perhaps, than they are now. Is the White House, is the Biden campaign expecting debates this fall?
Yeah, both men look different today than they did in those clips from 3.5 years ago. I think this expectation of debate probably does not happen. First of all, Trump and has turned the Republicans along with him against the debate commission, suggesting they were biased against them. They had rigged previous debates. Remember this nonsense about the microphone, and of course there was, and then last time around, because he got COVID, and there was a real suggestion that he had COVID in that first debate. So therefore the committee tried to make the second one remote. He said no. So there's a lot of bad blood there between Trump. We'll see if that would even happen. It might have to be under the umbrella of a different organization. That would be complicated. The Biden people I talked to do think that if Trump says he's going to debate, and if he really goes through with it, and Trump has said he wants to, they probably have to. They feel like that it would look like he's ducking them. And also just because Biden and Democrats are just for the, fancy themselves, Joe, on like the side of good, and debates are good inherently for an election. They're the defenders of democracy. We should have debates. That the Biden would sort of be boxed in, would probably have to go through with a debate if Trump really wants one. But they certainly have ways out of it, as you just listed, to say that, well, this guy hasn't participated in any debates. Why should we give him that opportunity? But I think, Joe, there's a sense that the people I've talked to in the Biden campaign think that at the end of the day, Trump will blink and it won't actually happen.
Well, I think Trump could blink. You go back, and if I'm running Trump's campaign, God help me, and I'm not saying this, I'm not being facetious. I'm very concerned about a guy that goes out at night, gives a speech in front of a friendly crowd, and he can't remember who he ran against in 2016. He can't remember who he ran against in 2020. He can't remember who he's running against in 2024. He chokes the name Obama out of his mouth and then comes back to it because it's the only name that his brain can retain. Of course, we know what happened when he started. He's like, Nikki. And then went on, again, did the same sort of thing where he sort of choked her last name out, went on to talk, and then he came back to Nikki Haley, who he thought was Speaker of the House. Caddy, maybe they bluff, maybe the Trump team bluffs, but it just takes something like that with Donald Trump, who seems far more prone to making these type of mistakes. Because if Joe Biden says Mexico instead of Egypt, he completes the thought and he comes back and he's explaining the process and he comes back to Egypt and Sisi. That's something that Donald Trump's not been capable of doing. And you go back and you look at debates. 1976, Gerald Ford makes the blunder on Poland. It may have cost him the presidency. 88, Michael Dukakis finished himself off for good when he had that answer about Kitty Dukakis from Bernie Shaw. I think they're trying to protect Trump a bit more because he goes out and he loses train of thought and starts saying really stupid things. So I'm not so sure you're going to have the Trumpers eager to have this
I
debate.
mean, one thing that you know a debate with Trump is never going to be, Alexi, is an honest explanation of complex topics. That's not going to happen. And what is the Trump campaign worried about? When I speak to them, they feel like they're in a good place in terms of their lining up policies. They think their operation is getting better. They've got a plan for the first 100 days, which they didn't have first time around. The one thing they're worried about, Donald Trump. They're worried about the kinds of things that might come out of his mouth. Well, if he's in a debate situation like we saw him just there, getting exercised and emotional, that is when Donald Trump says things like Nikki Haley's a bird brain, or, you know, he denigrates people, or he's rude about people, or he throws out gratuitous, offensive things. That's what his campaign is worried about him doing on the stump anyway, because who does that alienate? All of those suburban voters we were talking about in the first half of the show, from Philadelphia and Atlanta.
By the way,
and
Katie,
Detroit.
he mangles the English language when he's reading the teleprompter.
Yeah, he does.
He loses his train of thought and gets lost even when he's reading the teleprompter.
And to some extent, he's always done that, and his diehard supporters forgive him for that anyway. I think it's the gratuitous, offensive things that he says that particularly worry the campaign in terms of turning off suburban women voters.
Yeah.
And in a high, tense debate situation, that's where he could do that. That's where Biden, if he was on form and quick enough, could goad him into doing something like that.